Well, this is different. It's like St. Michael's version of a cathedral, with most of the congregation electing to be in the transept over here. So I'm going to alter where I deliver my remarks from a bit, although I see my wife, bless her heart, is way back there in the Bob Uecker seats, for those of you that remember that commercial. Yeah, well, Merry Christmas, everyone. Please be seated. Well, like it or not, we human beings are stellar storytelling animals. Storytelling animals. We are shaped by the stories we tell and the stories we hear. Through stories, we understand ourselves, and it is through stories that we understand each other. God created us this way. And this is why, manifested as Jesus, he delivered his message through parables and stories instead of doctrines and dogmas. It is why the authors of Matthew and Mark included stories of Jesus' origin in their Gospels. And in every good story, there are stories within the story. The scandal, and the beauty. And an important story within the incarnation stories is that God chooses to entrust ordinary human beings, like Mary, to be his conduit, his means of being materially with us as we live on this little blue ball called Earth. Mary is arguably the most inspiring example of this. Think about it. After agreeing to Gabriel's frightening proposition, after celebrating with Elizabeth in Hebron, which, as Father Mike over here noted in his sermon Sunday, probably took her 2 weeks of walking to get to. After 9 months of pregnancy, a 70-mile walk from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and then delivering Jesus in a strange place among strangers, she must have been exhausted. And rather than being able to settle in for a rest there in Bethlehem, a bunch of ragged shepherds barge in on her, yammering on and on about extraordinary events in the heavens, foreshadowing her new baby's birth. In recounting how inspirational Mary is to her, Rachel Held Evans has beautifully written, God trusted God's very self, totally and completely and in full bodily form, to the care of a woman. God needed a woman for survival. Before Jesus fed us with the bread and the wine, the body and the blood, Jesus himself needed to be fed by a woman. He needed a woman to say, "This is my body given for you." Mary is indeed an example of God, using the ordinary for the extraordinary. She is not Wonder Woman flying through the air, yet She is capable of being a conduit for bringing God's love into the world. Not by magic, but rather through the very real biological process of nurturing a fetus, birthing it, and caring for it until it is able to care for itself. In this way, the story within the story tells us that the ordinary, like you and like me, is capable of the extraordinary. And similarly, Matthew begins his origin story with another story within a story. He starts with a 17-verse genealogy of Jesus. While we often focus on Jesus' connection to Abraham, there is more going on here. Matthew includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. There were murderers, adulterers, liars, schemers, prostitutes, and people who committed incest included in Jesus' lineage. Matthew very candidly tells us that Jesus came down to us through broken families, one generation begetting brokenness of another, and another, and another. We see that Matthew has included within this story of Jesus' lineage the countercultural, radical idea for his time that the past is not always prologue. If Jesus himself came from a line of murderers, adulterers, cheats, and frauds, then there is hope for us all, right? Jesus is a cycle breaker. Jesus is showing that generations of dysfunction don't have to be predictive of future events. Cycles can be broken. Systems can be replaced. Families, and therefore whole nations, can be healed. I actually love that we have 3 different accounts of what happened that first Christmas. They each have their charm and their own power. But this year, for some reason, I'm mostly drawn to the Christmas story in John. There are no manger, no angels, just these mystical verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Maybe I was drawn to John's story because Saturday was the winter solstice, the very longest night of the year. In the darkness of the longest night, these words from John were on repeat in my head. A light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered it. This is the thing about light. Even the tiniest bit of light scatters the deepest darkness. It never happens the other way around, never. Darkness has no effect on light. Darkness cannot touch it, cannot extinguish it, cannot do a thing about it. And the light, that is Christmas. What happened the night Christ was born over 2,000 years ago and thousands of miles away is still visible, like a star. They tried to kill him, and it didn't work. They arrested him, put him on trial, they beat him, stripped him, mocked him, killed him, and put him in a grave, and even then, the light still shone. He rose from the tomb, shining as bright as ever. Darkness. Darkness thinks it's so clever, doesn't it? Thinks it's so powerful. But compared to the light of Christ, it is nothing. Not really. So this is what I want you to remember today. Christmas Day. A light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overpower it. A light shines in the world, and this world cannot overpower it. A light shines in you, and you cannot overpower it. My friends, Merry Christmas. May the light of Christ scatter any darkness in your hearts and minds. Because remember, the days are getting longer now. Amen.